Chapter 12. True dark had settled by the time Mud, Hera, and Drakecutter got off the high shoulder and into a more sheltered glen. Mud slumped to the ground and eased his boots off. From the way his feet throbbed, he feared the bandages would be soaked with blood. It surprised him when he unwound them to find new pink skin beneath. A campfire crackled alive, and Mud looked up to see the dwarf coax into a roaring flame. "Stop!" Mud said. "You have to keep the fire small so it won't be seen by enemies." "What enemies?" Drakecutter grunted and shoved another log on the blaze. "The dragon, for one," Mud said. The heat stung his feet and he inched away from the fire. "I hope she does see it," Drakecutter growled. "Come here, you big ugly beast," he yelled into the dark. "You can't hide forever." Mud groaned. Hera reached out and stopped Drakecutter from adding yet another piece of wood to the fire. "We're not hunting the dragon, remember. We're going to plant this." "Besides," Mud said, rising and drawing his sword, "the dragon isn't our only enemy. There may be a Civic Draconian working with her, but I imagine he'd be a lot easier to kill." Drakecutter dropped the log and pulled out a broad-bladed dagger. "A Civic? You mean a shape-changer?" "Yes," Hera said. "The dragon couldn't have taken the axe from your house without demolishing everything. She has someone working with her, either a human or a Civic in human form. We saw the Draconian's footprints." Mud gripped his sword and eased into a fighting stance. "Of course, it can take any form it wants by simply killing the person it needs to look like." He tensed for an attack. Drakecutter frowned and stared off into the forest. "We'd better take turns keeping watch at night, then. I hate Draconians. My father told me about fighting them. Evil spawn of the Dark Queen. I'd like to stick my knife into a few." Mud frowned. Drakecutter didn't act like Mud imagined a Draconian would. Mud couldn't have come out more clearly in accusing it, but Drakecutter hadn't responded like a Draconian in disguise. Hera cleared her throat. "Drakecutter, you weren't planning on fighting a dragon with that dagger, did you?" Drakecutter looked down at his hand. The weapon he held was a good sturdy dagger, thick enough that it wouldn't break easily, and sharp enough to be effective against anything but plate mail or dragon scales. Drakecutter flushed. "Of course not, if you have to know. I planned to sneak into her lair and get my father's axe, then kill her. No sense hefting up another axe up the mountain, since it would be as useless as this dagger against the dragon." He put the dagger away. "Now, how about some food and some sleep? Mud seems ready to take the first watch." Hera and Drakecutter sat down to eat. Mud kept his sword out and ready until he couldn't stand the smell of toasted bread and cheese any longer. Then he set it aside and gobbled a bit of food. He slept little that night, taking first watch, then watching Drakecutter keep second watch. Hera got up for the third watch. Mud waited for Drakecutter to fall into deep snores before rising and patting her where she stood, away from the smoldering remains of the fire. "Hera," Mud said. She started and turned to him with her knife drawn. "You're supposed to be asleep, Mud. The healer told me you will need plenty of rest for your body to recover." "I'll sleep now, but I want you to keep an eye on Drakecutter." Mud was tired. It had been a struggle to stay awake so far. "Drakecutter, why?" Hera glanced at the sleeping dwarf. "Just in case what we saw at the bottom of the cliff wasn't his pack," Mud said. "What else could it be?" Hera asked. Mud didn't want to tell her that Drakecutter might be dead, but she had to know for her own safety. In a whisper he explained to her his theory about a Civac taking Drakecutter's form. Hera stood silent, fingering her knives. When he finished, she pivoted so she could see Drakecutter as well as the dark forest beyond the camp. "You haven't slept all night, have you?" she asked. Mud shook his head. "It's a long road to Palanthas," Hera said, her face grim in the red light of the glowing coals. "I suggest you and I keep own watch scheduled. Half the night each." Mud nodded, surprised she accepted his theory without argument. He crawled onto his bedroll and pulled the blanket over him. At last glance at his sister showed her cheeks wet with tears. End of chapter 12.